Good evening. I think we'll start. I know we have a series of conflicting things later on. The Remembrance Scholars want to leave at 8:30, and some people want to hear a debate at 9. But I have lots of food ordered, so please, if you're a Remembrance Scholar, come back and get some food because we need to eat it all up, or take some on your way out. I'll double check with the lady in charge out there and make sure she lets you grab it as you run off to your candlelight ceremony. I'm Susan Wadley, a professor of anthropology, and it was my inspiration to try to get someone to talk about quilting and memory when the topic for this year's Syracuse Symposium was announced last winter, and I thought, well, quilts are really, really important in memory, so I wanted to do that. And then I discovered a book by Marsha MacDowell called Weavings of War, which struck me as the kinds of memories that maybe we didn't want to have but should be reflecting on. And it turned out I tapped into the right person because she's in the midst of finishing a book on human justice and quilting. So it gives me great pleasure tonight to introduce Dr. Marsha MacDowell, who's curator of folk arts at the Michigan State Museum and professor in the Department of Art and Art History. She has been primarily engaged in the documentation and analysis of the production, meaning, and use of traditional material culture for decades, but she's particularly interested in quilts and other fabric arts. Her books and articles, some of which my class will be reading shortly, have dealt with Native American, African American quilting traditions, the Hmong, and more recently, South African quilting traditions. It is her edited volume, Weavings of War, that led us to this invitation that brings her here tonight. Her work as a publicly engaged scholar is grounded in an interdisciplinary approach to material culture and is informed primarily by art history, folklore, and ethnographic theories. She's been particularly interested in developing research projects in collaboration with representatives of the communities and culture groups that she's working with, and is being engaged in projects that have a positive impact on societal needs. And I know that one of her next projects is actually quilts and healing. She has also been involved with a number of digital projects, including the Quilt Index, Quilt Treasures, which is an online archive of late 20th century quilters, the Oral History in a Digital Age, and the South African Quilt History Project. Marsha, we welcome you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, well, I have a combination of reading some text and then showing some slides and commenting on slides, and interjected somewhere in here, I have embedded a link to a short YouTube piece, which I hope will work, but we'll see. Okay, my topic is piecing peace, and I can't help but use a lot of puns when I am dealing with the topic of quilts, so bear with me. There's some more inside my comments tonight. Okay, textiles have long been used, mainly by women, though not solely by women, as a medium to express feelings, values, and experiences that reflect upon and motivate action related to issues and needs in contemporary society, including the violations of and needs to enforce human rights, those international moral and legal norms that aim to protect all people everywhere from severe political, legal, and social abuses, and that allow individuals to live in dignity. These rights usually include the right to life, freedom from torture, freedom of movement, the right to an adequate standard of living, freedom of religion, the right to self-determination, the freedom of speech, the right to participation in cultural and political life, and the right to education. Textile artists who use their skills to express issues related to human rights do so in many different ways and for many different purposes. One form of textiles, quilts, has proven an especially potent and popular form for artists to demonstrate solidarity with movements dedicated to advancing international human rights, to mark important events related to human rights violations, to pay tribute to those individuals who have played roles in human rights activism, to provide vehicles for the expression of feelings and memories about human rights violations, and to engage individuals in actions that will solve human rights issues. Ariel Zeitlin-Cook, my collaborator on the Weavings of War project, said in her essay on textiles of war, textiles, possibly because they are so portable, you know, as long as you aren't lugging around one of those sewing machines, they are so common in art and so important a cultural symbol in so many societies. They seem to be one of the most widespread traditional medium used to depict modern war. It is similarly not surprising that individuals, especially some of the millions involved in quilt making, have employed their skills to express experience or support of human rights causes. And if you haven't heard this already, there are over 21 million people affiliated with quilt making in the US alone. And the numbers are large proportionally in Japan, in places like France, Australia, and really from our work on the Quilt Index, you know, we get the email addresses of, we're able to do analytics on the users of the Quilt Index. We can tell you that we have people in every country in the world who go to that digital resource because of interest in quilts. So pieced and patched textiles have long played roles in personal testimonies and public discourse about individual and collective experience with conflict. This lecture tonight will examine the history and meaning, just a slight nod to history because we're going to go right to more contemporary pieces, but the history and meaning of this aspect of material culture production. And I'll highlight some specific visual examples and their associated stories, because while I am a professor of art and art history, I'm really a folklorist. So I like the visual, but I also equally give value to the story. And before I go further, I just want to say that this research endeavor is also collaborative in another sense, more than even Dr. Wardley said, because I do this with this research with a team of other researchers. And especially I want to call out my colleagues Lynn Swanson, Mary Worrell, and Beth Donaldson, two of whom are quilt makers as well. In a footnote, I have made one quilt. I may make another quilt in my lifetime, but I have made one. So I've been blessed to have been able to work for many years also in a museum led by my colleague and life partner, my husband, with whom I've done a lot of this research as well, and now also my daughter, who's on the faculty of City College of New York. So it's an endeavor among friends and colleagues and family. This topic seemed to get some kind of critical action when we decided to look into our museum collections to see what we could pull from for an exhibition slot, because suddenly a gallery opening came up on the museum exhibition schedule and we didn't have something at the ready to go into it. Well, we started thinking about the work that we had done on projects like Weavings of War and the African American Quilt Project and the Native American Quilt Project, which was done with the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian. And we started thinking about what we could cull from those projects. And what we were realizing is that every one of those projects, we probably had approached it with a worldview and a mindset to look for it already, but every one of those projects had quilts that related to human rights. And when we started pulling those pieces that we had subsequently collected for our museum collection, we realized that we had almost an exhibition in and of itself. So some of these that you will be seeing tonight are actually ones that are in the MSU Museum collection, and others we acquired or borrowed afterwards to form a whole quilt exhibit around the topic of human rights and quilts. Okay, but let me just step back in time a little bit, because quilts and the production of quilts and human rights is not just a contemporary phenomenon. It has its roots in history, and we can go back decades to look at the intersection of the making of quilts and human rights. And so let me just call out a little bit of those historical notes. There isn't a whole lot that's known about the relationship between needleworkers and human rights activism in the early years of this century, just going back this century. But studies of women's activities in the 19th century in the U.S. clearly document their extensive engagement in social reform movements, even in the establishment of things like colleges. And I was asking about the Syracuse that was founded as a Methodist action, and dare say it was a lot of women who were involved in that action as they were in the establishment of so many campuses across the country. Because this was also an era of expanding involvement in quilt making, it was no wonder that thousands of women began to use their needle skills to prick the nation's conscience about injustices or issues that they felt needed to be addressed. Much of the women's activity during this period was church-affiliated, especially with Protestant denominations. Many, many churches had sewing circles that made clothing for the poor, socks and bandages for soldiers, or quilts that could be given to the needy or sold to raise funds for identified local and world causes. One form of quilt that became especially popular in these fundraising efforts was one that was called either usually a subscription quilt or a fundraising quilt. And individuals donated little bits of money to like a dime or a nickel to have the privilege of having their names written on that quilt. And then that quilt represented then the collective action of a number of people raising money at that time, quite serious money, that was then enabling all kinds of actions. In fact, thousands of subscription quilts were made to raise funds to support the Red Cross during World War I. And even relatively small contributions added up. And when one considers that thousands of these quilts were made to support different causes, the buying powers of the dollars or the coins at certain times and in certain locales, the economic impact of this tradition is substantial. And when other avenues to engage in support for causes were denied women, making subscription quilts proved an effective tool to demonstrate their convictions and to channel skills and energies that would make a difference in the causes that they believed in. Many quilts were made in the 19th century to support the abolition of slavery. Women, black and white, joined female anti-slavery associations or societies, some of which held fairs and bazaars where they sold needlework to raise money to support their cause. During the Civil War, thousands of women used their needle skills to support the Union Army, and by 1862, many of their efforts were organized under the umbrella organization called the United States Sanitary Commission. As many as 7,000 local women's aid societies were affiliated with that commission. And it's estimated that over 250,000 quilts were made. That's a lot of energy. It's a lot of work towards one cause. Of course, women in the South also formed organizations to support their soldiers, but none were as massive as the Commission or incorporated quilt making to such an extent. One 19th century and early 20th century cause that was of special concern to women in the U.S. was their right to vote. And in fact, in the early years of the women's rights movement, sewing and the institutions that supported it, such as quilting bees and sewing circles, functioned as they did for other reform groups, as a way to both raise funds and recruit new members, but also they were able to make quilts that incorporated messages in them. So they became a tool for publicly acknowledging their stance on this important topic. And even Susan B. Anthony spoke about women's rights at gatherings where women were quilting together, and one flag-like quilt carries her name and along with at least 350 others. Today, artists around the world make quilts to portray transgressions of human rights by governments, businesses, and individuals. Quilts have been made, for instance, about rape, incest, domestic abuse, indigenous rights, workers' rights in Chile, civil rights in the U.S., Holocaust in Europe, and apartheid and xenophobia in South Africa. Some of these quilts were simply made as memorials, and some were made as educational pieces specifically to raise awareness of the violations of rights and the call for assistance and action. So many of the same traditions associated with quilt making in the 19th and the 20th century are continuing today. And quilt making or quilt gatherings are still times when issues are discussed, and I love down in the Memorial Chapel basement today, I saw the not only the quilts that you all, or some of you all, are making, but I also saw the sign up for crochet and conversation, coming together over textile production to actually talk about issues. So there are times when issues are discussed, they are made for fundraisers, and quilt makers still incorporate into their work symbolic and literal depictions of experiences, beliefs, and statements. If anything, the only major difference might be that today more quilt makers intentionally make quilts as visual messages rather than bed covers. And there is no one visual or technical style of quilts related to human rights. Some quilts give very little, if any, visual clues that they are connected to human rights. It is in their stories, though, of why they were made and how they were used that we learn of their deep connections to human rights. At this point, I'm going to begin to take a look at some of those examples. Okay, here's a Hawaiian Flag quilt. I mentioned I worked on this exhibition that was called To Honor and Comfort Native Quilting Traditions. And I was working with a group of Native Hawaiian quilt makers, and I knew of this flag quilt tradition in Hawaii, and I dearly wanted one of those quilts in our exhibition. And I contacted a number of museums. I could not get one lent to us because of the cost of shipping them from Hawaii to the U.S. or to the mainland, or they were in such fragile conditions that other museums wouldn't loan ours. So two Native Hawaiians, Sharon and Harriet, Sung or Belai and Sung, they surprised us with this gift of one that they made for that exhibition because they said, this is probably the single most important Native Hawaiian quilt tradition, and it must be in that exhibition. And the story of this is that the Hawaiian flag was first designed for the Hawaiian King Kamehameha the first, sometime prior to 1916, and the flag had 8 stripes representing the 8 islands, and its incorporation of the Union Jack represented the island's close ties to Great Britain. The Hawaiian flag was only taken down twice in history. Once when Queen Liliuokalani was deposed in 1893, and again permanently when the islands were annexed to the U.S. in 1898. So this quilt depicting the flag of the Hawaiian Kingdom probably appeared in Hawaii as early as 1843. And when the quilts, or when the flag was taken down, there was an uptick in the number of quilts that were made like this. And they were not made to be sat upon or shown on a wall, but they were made to cover a bed and make a statement that Native Hawaiian identity was still strong. And it's called My Beloved Quilt in by a lot of Native Hawaiians. As Sharon said, she will not make one that is bed size because she doesn't even want it used on a bed. I don't think people should sit on this because it's like a desecration to our honor, our background, our ancestry. I wouldn't sit on anybody's flag. And each flag represents a special group of people, and although we cannot agree on everything in the world, we can agree to respect you for being who you are. The late artist Gwendolyn McGee of Jackson, Mississippi, made this quilt. It was part of a series of quilts that she made that had strong statements about social issues. And this one, employing a Ku Klux Klan hood, hanging bodies of lynch victims, and a Confederate flag, it contains these powerful symbols of racism. And she says, "This quilt is my response to the future of the April 17th, 2001 referendum for the state of Mississippi to adopt a flag without the Confederate battle emblem. Proponents to retain it stated that it is just a symbol of Southern pride and Southern heritage. My goal with this piece is to expose exactly that of which they are so proud, a heritage that glorifies slavery, a heritage based on racism and hatred, a heritage that committed atrocities and unspeakable acts of savagery, and a heritage dedicated to oppression by using terrorist tactics to instill fear and impose subservience." It's just a quilt, right? Just a quilt. One way that quilt makers draw attention to human rights is by making quilts that honor champions of human rights. Ojibwa Anishinaabe quilt maker Judy Toppings of White Earth Reservation in Minnesota is a longtime activist for Native rights. Her News from Native Country quilt was made to make people aware of the struggles of Native American people and to recognize some who have worked hard for the causes of Native Americans. Incorporated into this quilt are photo transfers of newspaper articles about key individuals such as Leonard Peltier, who have been imprisoned for their activism on behalf of Native rights. And in this one, which again looks sort of harmless, it's a sampler quilt. It's got scenes of landscape and people fiddling and jigging up in the corner. Well, down on let's see if I can use this. Right here in this block it's a little hard to see here, but in that one block in this quilt made by members of the Calico Country Quilt Guild, a group of native and non-native quilt makers who live on the Turtle Mountain Reservation in Belcourt, North Dakota. Louis Riel was a Métis activist who was hung because of his work in trying to defend his nation. So that one block right there makes this whole quilt a political statement and a piece of memory art. Ruby Bridges, the young sixth grader who had to go to a integrated school, and this one this quilt was made by artist Marion Coleman of California, and she became the first, Ruby Bridges, the first African-American child to attend an all-white elementary school in the South. Ruby Bridges is still living today and speaking out on racism and the need for healing. So this is a commemorative quilt honoring a person who stood up and was part of our history of racism in this country. Fina Nkosi of Soweto is a domestic worker who travels from Soweto into Johannesburg every day. She made this quilt, which is a series of portraits of Black South African women activists against apartheid. And it starts with the woman with the head wrap on, let's see, right there is Winnie Mandela. And then some of the most famous women in South Africa, some of whom were killed for their activism, are memorialized on that quilt. In my work on African American quilting, I think it was probably early 1980s, I was documenting stories of quilters and getting life histories of African American quilt makers in Michigan. And I kept coming across women who were making quilts in support of anti-apartheid work in South Africa. And they were making quilts about Nelson Mandela. And then on the day he was released from prison, I don't know how many women told me that they sat down and they started making a quilt in joy that he was released from prison. And then again, when he was elected president, in joy that country now had a democratically elected president. Carol Harris is an art quilter in Detroit who made such a quilt. And also Beverly White of Pontiac, Michigan, made another variation on that quilt. And I've got scores of these. And it's just, to me, so fascinating that these world events had impact all over the world on textile artists who used this medium to make her statement of her reaction in support of that event. Beverly White actually called me up several years later after I had done the interview with her, and she said that she wanted to donate that quilt as well as this quilt to the Michigan State University Museum. And again, when we were casting about, thinking about what we had in our collections to put into an exhibition on quilts and human rights, here were at least, I think, 5 quilts that had been given to us by artists who saw that this was an important focus for a collection. Yeah, Beverly made this one that has, she called View from the Mountaintop. She made it to teach others, students, her own students, family members, friends, about important heroes in African American history. So you have Medgar Evers, Thurgood Marshall, Martin Luther King, Harriet Tubman, Francis Harper, Sojourner Truth, Mary Bethune, Ralph Bunche, Booker T. Washington, and it's a great tribute. She says, I cannot chronicle the brave and valiant fight of each and every one of the honorable souls who have fought for the rights of African Americans throughout the history of the U.S. I can, however, attempt to show several of those heroes who have impressed me. Perhaps their souls will move other African Americans to produce more and more quilts that will extol their efforts and keep the struggle alive to ensure the ultimate goal of equality for all. Well, unfortunately, tonight's event is conflicts with the debate, but I put this in one here into this slide set just to make my own personal political statement. But this was made by quilt artist Denise Schmidt of Bridgeport, Connecticut. And she did this as a fundraiser because there was a whole element of the 2008 campaign. It was, I think, crafting for change. And you could make crafted items and donate them to the Obama cause. And on the occasion of Barack Obama becoming U.S. president, at least 3 different separate exhibitions were mounted in tribute to his becoming the first African American president. And one of those exhibitions included Sherry Shine of New York or New Jersey, her quilt called Fearless, a quilt that pays homage to both Obama and to Rosa Parks, who is seen here in that really well-known image of her sitting on the bus in a seat. It was actually, I know this from talking with her myself, that was a recreated situation. She was seated on the bus, and then there was a white man behind her. Rosa Parks, also we interviewed her in the 1980s about her own quilt making tradition, which, by the way, anybody who thinks that they know the characteristics of an African American quilt, I defy them to be able to describe those and discern them if you don't know who made the quilt. Mrs. Parks' quilts look nothing like the quilts that are said to be African American, and geez, I think she is African American. So, okay, so quilts are made as memorials to those who died as a result of human rights violations. I think I was so delighted to be able to see the remembrance quilt in the chapel here. Quilts are made for every possible, to commemorate any possible action. And in fact, our museum owns the Oklahoma City bombing quilt that was given to us. It was made by employees affiliated with the union that all of those government workers in Oklahoma City were members of. And so after several years of that large Oklahoma City bombing quilt being circulated around the country, they realized that volunteer group couldn't find a place in Oklahoma City to deposit that quilt. And because we had borrowed it for display on a couple of occasions, they contacted us, and we very gladly are now the home of that quilt, which we think is very important, just like that quilt that you have here. It just speaks volumes. The thread, the cloth, the images, the names speaks volumes about the emotions, and not only of the time, but years later, when you see those pictures of how many students, 35? Was it 35 students here at Syracuse? It just floods right back. This quilt is made by a woman, April Shipsin, who is herself African American. She is an engineer. She works for Chrysler. She worked on this lynching quilt for probably 3 years, I think it took her. And she did research. Well, first of all, she saw a photograph of lynching. I think it was the exhibition that was out there, Without Witness. It was of photographs of lynchings. She saw that exhibition, she saw the book, and she became acutely aware for the first time ever that it wasn't just men who were lynched, but also women and children. And that so moved her that she began this lynching quilt. She did the research on it. She researched the names, as many as she could find, of people who are documented to have been lynched between the years, 1965 to 1965, which is also staggering to think that they were still being lynched. So, and then she arranged the image, or she embroidered in gold thread on a black cloth each name that she could find, and then she did it, arranged them in columns by state. So it's much like going to the Vietnam War Memorial, where you are reading quilts. And when we borrowed this quilt from her and hung it, people were going up with their iPhones and taking pictures of the name, any name, even if it was, or if they had relatives in Tennessee, they were taking pictures of the Tennessee block and sending them away. So it had that same kind of impact of just seeing the sheer number of names. And then for those where she couldn't, well, she knew that there were many more names of people that had been lynched than were recorded, she just put at the end of each section, and others. So, and she told quite a story to me that she finished the quilt, took her about 3 years, and she went home from her job every night and just sewed. And she had a automatic sewing machine, so she didn't always sit there and do it herself. She programmed it. She is an engineer after all. But it took 3 or 4 hours of sewing every night to be able to do that. She got it done, and then she wanted to have the nooses up at the top, but she said she doesn't know how to tie a knot or a noose. And so she got a friend to get the rope and make it human size noose, neck size noose. And he delivered those 2 nooses to her at her workplace. And she said they were in a bag, and she put them underneath her desk. And she said she couldn't open up the bag because it was so emotional. And it just knowing that the nooses were in the bag under her desk was unnerving. But finally she took them out and sewed them onto the top of the quilt. So the whole piece is very, very, very powerful. It's massive, too. It's a huge, huge quilt. And I do have a clip. Now I'm going to try and do this of her talking. Right click, right? Left click, okay. Let's see if it works.
My name is April Elaine Ship, and I'm from Southfield / Auburn Hills, Michigan. I grew up in Detroit on the northwest side. I went to Mary Wright High School. I've been quilt making for over 20 years, mother of 2 children, one of 13 children myself. My mother was a quilt maker, but died when I was very young. I taught myself through watching public television. Georgia Bone still would come on early in the morning, and I'd wake up to watch her talk about lap quilts. So I ordered her books from the PBS, Channel 56 in Detroit. And I bought the books, and I began to explore the wonderful world of quilt making. I've always made my own garments, but I wanted to try to make it the quilts as well. And I love it. It's my passion. What's on the wall today started with a friend of mine, a coworker named Chris, had seen an Oprah Winfrey show with this artist on there who made a book called, The Faces of Our Past, North Women's History. And I didn't buy the book at first. I went to go see the book at the bookstore. And I went to go see the book. And when I got there, in the book was a photograph of a woman and her son who had been lynched in 1911 over the Canadian River Bridge. At that point in my life, I never knew they lynched women. I thought they lynched men, criminals, but not women. We'd be exempt. I'd be okay if I lived back then. That's what I told myself. So upon seeing her photograph, I closed the book and I went to my car and I cried and I prayed and I said, Father God, someone needs to do something about this. So not meaning me, not me, but just someone needs to fix this problem. So I was driving in my car, and I believe at that moment, the voice of God said to me, find their names and make a quilt. This sounds really, I know, crazy, but this is how it happened for me. So I says, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to find the names. It's too big for me. Find somebody else. I don't want this job. This is a big job. Finally, I succumbed to making the quilt. It took me 3 years to make Strange Fruit. Strange Fruit weighs 12 pounds and has the names of the African-American men, women, and children who were lynched and murdered in this country in a 100-year period. This is not just African-American history, but this is American history. This is American history. In making Strange Fruit, I cried every day. I cried every time I read a name or a story of someone who had died in this horrific way. And I wanted to honor their memory. I didn't want to show them hanging from trees or on fire. I wanted to show them, give them dignity, and give them the love and honor they they need, and that's what I wanted to do. Well, I had to pray a lot, because in making this quilt, you cannot see the names of these people.
Edited clip on YouTube if you want to hear the rest of her story. But I wanted to show you that not only because I wanted you to hear it in her words, but also because it conveys the intensity of feeling and commitment to using quilts as a tool for education. Another Michigan quilt maker, Anika Fair, dedicated this survivor's quilt to her mother, who was a Holocaust survivor. Here's what Anika says. She was liberated in Bergen-Belsen. After liberation, Bergen-Belsen became a DP camp. It took her a while to recuperate from starvation. Once she was physically stronger, she wanted to return home and find her family. Survivors were promised transportation home, but after many months, no transportation was provided. My mother, with 4 other survivors from Budapest, decided to go home on their own. Most of their journey was on foot. Somewhere on that journey, a tiny group photo was taken of the 5 survivors. In that photo, my mother is the second from left. The large portrait is also of her when she was old and fragile before she passed away. My friend and Washington, D.C. based artist, also an anthropologist, Dr. Diana Njai, has made a number of quilts dealing with human rights. This one began as a commentary on Katrina and the actions, or in the case of Katrina, non-action by government. Of her, Baron Samde visits his New Orleans quilt. Njai says, Baron Samdi was in the sacred traditions of Haiti and in New Orleans, is both guardian of the cemetery and the Iwa of procreation, fertility, and virility. And I always saw the image of the crowded ships here that brought Africans across the Middle Passage to these shores in the Caribbean as powerful, but as I sewed the images to the quilt, marking the stitches with attention to the number of human beings whose bodies lay side by side, I suddenly had a visceral sense of what it must have been like to be on that ship. The boats that bring Haitians, because now she's also commenting on the earthquake in Haiti. The boats that bring Haitians on the risky journey to the U.S. borders, as depicted in the quilts, are equally as crowded as were some of the boats attempting to rescue Katrina's survivors. It was tempting to include images from and allusions to the recent earthquake, but chose to deal with water-related issues only in this piece. I wanted the quilt, though depicting devastation, to be beautiful. She wanted the quilt to be beautiful, even in the depiction of tragedy, in homage to the people of both Haiti and New Orleans, who continue with so much tragedy with spirit and creativity. And this is another one of Diana Njai's pieces, so many twin towers, and, yeah, you can see she's transferred images of the towers into little pieces. So you have to look closely to find the twin towers, but they're embedded within that design all over. And then around the edge of the quilt are bombs. This one is another one by Marion Coleman, who made the Ruby Bridges quilt. This one is called Angry Young Men, and we had this on exhibit. We brought it back out of storage and had it on exhibit since earlier this year in support of the horrible incident in Florida. Angry Young Men. She says, this was to examine urban violence, the criminal justice system in the U.S., and community ambivalence toward the loss of a generation of young African American men. There appears to be a lack of public will to address their basic human right to have an enriched life, health, education, and prosperity. She hopes that this quilt brings attention to the continued disparity in rights that African Americans, and young men especially, are accorded in our country. And this one is by another friend, Chris Warland, who went to, as a public K-12 teacher, went to South Africa on an exchange with teachers there. And this one, she got so moved by the notion that it was only in very recent history that South Africans had to carry pass books to testify what race they were. And that was before 1990. Allison Williams of Curve Lake Reserve in Ontario made this quilt called The Tree of Peace Saves the Earth. And this alludes to an incident where in Quebec, where Mohawk Indians were protesting the developers who wanted to develop a golf course in what they perceived was their land. It was called the incident at Oka. And Alice was so outraged at how the Canadian government was acting towards these Mohawk Indians that she did this quilt, and all of these gray-shaped pieces here are the Canadian Parliament building being blown up. But in hope, the piece of hope in this quilt is this tree of peace that she thought would eventually prevail. Underneath the tree is buried war clubs. So there's a hope to that quilt. But she said that she personally wanted to pay tribute to and honor the Mohawk people because against great odds, they made known to the world and brought up to date the fact that we Aboriginal peoples all over the world are still trying to regain our rights to our lands, our cultures, our relatives, our languages, our beliefs and customs. Quilts and quilt making continue to be the cornerstone of major projects designed to raise awareness of and to directly address human rights issues. For example, more than 20,000 individuals, most of them women, were involved in the creation of a 15-mile-long sewn-together series of panels named the Peace Ribbon. And it was wrapped around the Pentagon on August 4th, 1985, 40 years after the U.S. used the atomic bomb against Japan as a call to stop the use of nuclear arms around the world. The Ugly Quilt Project is a more informal but also widespread project to take scraps of fabric and fashion bedrolls that are then distributed to the homeless. Though the bedrolls are not especially beautiful, they address the needs of the homeless in an absolutely tangible way. The NAMES Project AIDS Memorial Quilt, also known as the AIDS Quilt or the Quilts or the NAMES Project Quilt, is perhaps the world's largest project that involves quilted or pieced and patched panels to memorialize those who have died of a health pandemic and to motivate for health education and research to find a cure for AIDS. As of this year, there are more than, there are more than 50,000 panels. I said 40,000 earlier to somebody, but there are more than 50,000 panels that have been made for this quilt, and more are constantly being made. And here's one in our collection. We actually our staff made two, one for somebody we knew that we sent to the NAMES Project, and we made a second one that we would keep in our museum collection. Government agencies, world relief organizations, and individual activists have also initiated quilt projects to provide disadvantaged individuals with a means to supplement their income. And this piece right here is one that is out of a initiative in Haiti to help the income generation of people's, especially women, whose lives were upended by the earthquake there. This one here is part of a solar oven quilt project, Tanzania, where money is raised by selling quilts that's then sent to create solar operated ovens that provide a cheap way of energy to bake local bread. And then for some individuals, or for many individuals, quilt making has served as an important mechanism in coping with their own personal oppressive experiences. Barbara Hogan, who is a friend of mine, was held for years as a political prisoner in South Africa during apartheid. Eventually, after apartheid, she became a member of parliament and eventually became Minister of Health in South Africa. And I am so proud of her, she was the one who rebuked Thabo Mbeki and initiated the distribution of retroviral drugs in South Africa. So against her president, she advanced health care for AIDS. Barbara said once over lunch to me, she says, you know, when I asked her, did people do any did the women do any crafts while they were in prison? And Barbara said, well, yeah. She said, we did. And she said, I think I would have gone crazy all those years in prison if we did not have our quilting. I said, really? And then, mind you, there are many books written on Barbara Hogan as a political activist. And I said, geez, what happened to those quilts? And she said she gave them to fellow prisoners. And then she said, oh, wait. She said, you know what? The day I was unexpectedly released from prison, when they lifted the bans on political prisoners, and she'd been there 7 years, she said, I was making a quilt. And she said, I think my sister has that. And so she went over to her sister's house that night and brought me back this quilt. And she said, I don't think you'll really be interested in it because it wasn't finished. I said, Barbara, that's actually even more reason why I'm interested in it. And then she had this little envelope here that she said, even I didn't finish completely piecing it, so here is the envelope with the pieces. So we included that quilt in our exhibition. Here's another great statement, and there's just a couple more slides here. Statement by a woman in Michigan about under our skin, you know, we're all the same people. So this is a great commentary on xenophobia and racism. But the thing that once we started developing this exhibition concept and we started Google searching on any topic that we thought we'd be interested to know if there were quilts, and one of my colleagues Googled on incest, and she found actually in New Zealand there had been several exhibitions on human rights in quilts, and this is one of the quilts that was in that exhibition, and so we borrowed this from New Zealand. And this came along with a notebook of journaling the incidents that this woman had suffered in terms of incest. And this is my last slide, and this is another piece that came from New Zealand and about domestic abuse. And if you read around that circle, it says, stop hitting me. Let's see, I wasn't flirting with him. My baby is in the bath. Let me get him out. I'll just end with this quilt right here. I think the point that we were making with that exhibition, and the points I'm trying to convey to you all, is that many people will think of quilt making as a warm, fuzzy, domestic, comforting, artistic medium. And it is often all of those things, or many of those things, but they can also be hard-hitting tools to deal with tough problems. And in that, I think there is much to be celebrated. So anyway, thank you very much. Yeah, I'd be happy if anybody has any questions. Yeah. You mean, so if I understanding your question, if these textiles have incorporated things that are not handmade, but they're done in the context of the handmade?
More things other than quilts, I guess handmade or not. But have you noticed any other pieces of artwork other than quilts?
For memorialization?
Yeah, or it's just like this is for warmth, it's for memorializing, it's for making a statement in society. It takes on so many different forms, and I don't know if, like with ceramic work, I haven't done much research, but I haven't really noticed
No,
so much. Or like with so many different art forms, there's not people coming together or working alone.
no, it's a good, I get your question. No, I think the medium of quilt making is one that is particularly pervasive for this kind of action, because it lends itself to narratives already. And it is because of what I said earlier, is that so many people sewed. And it's a portable skill. It's just like that quote from Ariel Zeitlin. I mean, all you need is thread, a needle, and cloth. And you can do this art any place, anytime, anywhere. And it spans ages, the engagement of it, yes, it's mostly women, as I've repeatedly said here, but it's not only women. And so I think it's the accessibility of the art form, the portability of it, and its acceptedness in our society. And I think it just makes it the most accessible medium of choice for this kind of activity. And it can be done fairly quickly too. I mean, you don't even have to sew. You can just glue fabric on top of. Oh, did I say that? Okay. Yeah.
I was just going to respond. I used to run a domestic violence and rape crisis program, and there's something called the Clothesline Project.
Mm-hmm.
And there's sort of a color guide, but most women pay no attention to it. Because women, children, anybody who's been the survivor of violence can do a T-shirt. And some people quilt their T-shirt. I mean, depending on their skill level, people do all sorts of things. Often people can do their quilting in like a 2-hour, 2.5-hour block. And sometimes people write very distinct, their whole story, and often those quilts can't be publicly shown because they're just statements of rage. But lots of people are very artistic. So there's a wide variety and a very wide use of materials to display their feelings and it's much shorter even than a quilt.
Right. The Clothesline Project is a great project too. But the thing about the Clothesline Project is that you go to a Clothesline Project display knowing that you're going to see something it sort of self-selects the audience that comes to it, whereas what I love about Quilts and Human Rights is, and I know this from watching visitors come to the exhibition, is they come thinking they're going to see an exhibition of quilts and they're going to be nice, and then they go, oh my God, that it's not just your grandmother's quilt. It's something that is, just has such a powerful message to it. So, and I think it also attracts people. Those two words, quilts and human rights, it attracts people to think about the issues that wouldn't ordinarily think about the issues, and vice versa. It attracts people to quilts who wouldn't normally think of quilts as being something worthwhile investigating.
There's also a really long history of it back to the 1800s. So, quilts to talk about human rights is very prevalent in American society back to the temperance movement of the women traveling west and whatever.
Yeah, sure.
I was just thinking as you were talking that the American flag was sort of like a quilt in a way. It had a statement. It was a statement, and I was wondering if there were probably a lot of women. There were probably a lot
It could very well be. You know, one of the things I also am trying to make as a point is that in the kind of research I'm doing, I'm actually making it a point to get the maker's story or the user's story so that the object is not divorced from its context or the direct experience of the person who's made it or used it. And so that's why even with the Native Hawaiian quilts, it was so great to be able to interview Native Hawaiians and see how they're using them today, even though I'd read about it in the past. So it would be interesting to investigate just what you're asking,
Yeah, because
pointing out.
because the first USA, the first American flag in this country, the first flags were very, you know, people felt very optimistic about creating their own little country here,
Yeah,
as opposed to being British.
right. And I love what Gwendolyn McGee did with her quilt, and what you know, when you look at that first, you don't immediately see the KKK hood, and then all of a sudden that very subtle piece just jumps out at you, and you go, "Oh my goodness!" Yeah. Any other questions? Well, I can tell you this is the tip of the iceberg, what I've shown you. And to me, it's been such, and with my colleagues, it's been so fascinating to see the depth and the breadth of this activity. And we now can say, you name an issue, you name a cause, the quilts are out there. Sometimes it's a little harder to find them for some incidents, but we are trying to do that for the book that we're working on, and it's just so fascinating. Yeah. Thank you.